The clock strikes 07:35 on March 9, 1942. Dawn breaks unevenly over the Banda Sea, light spilling through fractured clouds like molten metal poured across glass. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, the same officer who had once led the attack on Pearl Harbor, stands on the tarmac at Kendari Airfield in the Dutch East Indies. His sharp eyes narrow as he hears the rumble long before the ground crew does. It is not the whine of Zero fighters or the hollow buzz of reconnaissance planes. It is a sound heavier, deeper, carrying the weight of machines that should not be here this early in the war. He turns, scanning the sky. What he sees cuts against everything he thought he knew about American aircraft. A formation of Boeing B-17 flying fortresses, sunlight glinting off the glass noses, silver outlines locked in disciplined lines. Fuchida mutters to his adjutant, "Kanzen ni shiroe," perfectly white. They dare to fly like parade columns. His tone is not admiration. It is warning. The visual sears itself into memory. Against the rising sun, the bombers look like mechanical predators, their fuselages reflecting gold, their wing-mounted engines clawing at the sky. Vapor trails scratch chalk lines behind them, precise and unbroken. The air vibrates with the hum of Wright R-1820 Cyclone engines, each propeller slicing air at 1,600 revolutions per minute, producing a combined drone that feels like a steel saw cutting across bone. For the Japanese pilots who scrambled to intercept, the sight is shocking. These are not lumbering transports. Gun ports flash along their sides, and from a distance the sunlight winks like polished mirrors. But the truth comes seconds later, when tracer rounds spit outward in long red chains. American bombers are not prey. They are armed citadels in the sky, and each carries 10 men trained to fight in every direction at once. To understand why these machines were here, so far from their home bases, one has to look beyond the sound of engines and the glare of gunfire. The Japanese Empire stretched across nearly 3.2 million square miles of ocean by the spring of 1942, and every mile demanded ships, fuel, and airfields to sustain. Every gallon of aviation gasoline, every ton of rubber or steel that moved from Java or Malaya back to Japan traveled along maritime arteries that could be severed with precision strikes. The B-17 was designed for exactly this purpose. If one bomber carried 4 tons of bombs, then a formation of 12 could drop nearly 50 tons on a single harbor. In simple math, that was enough explosive weight to torch an oil refinery or rip open a supply depot critical to feeding Japanese divisions in Burma or New Guinea. War was logistics, reduced to equations of distance and payload, and the United States had built a weapon designed to solve those equations from the air. The targets mattered because they were irreplaceable. Japan's petroleum came overwhelmingly from the Dutch East Indies, roughly 92% of its total wartime supply, War Department Petroleum Report, 1946. One oil field at Balikpapan could produce over 50,000 barrels per day. Destroy just one refinery, and Japanese carriers might sail without enough aviation fuel to cover their escorts. The Americans knew this. Every ton of bombs dropped was not simply metal and TNT, it was a calculation. If one refinery was erased, it could ground squadrons, starve convoys, and shrink the perimeter of the empire by hundreds of miles. For Japanese planners, accustomed to thinking of bombers as fragile tools of harassment, the realization that these flying fortresses could appear over vital supply routes, strike with tonnage equal to a cruiser's broadside, and then shoot their way back to safety was chilling. Action made the equation visceral. As the first B-17s banked inland, Japanese gunners opened fire, but the bombers closed ranks, their defensive machine guns creating interlocking fields of fire. Each fortress mounted up to 13.5 caliber Browning M2 Helgaka, each capable of 750 rounds per minute. That meant a formation of just 6 aircraft could unleash a theoretical wall of over 58,000 bullets in a single minute, far beyond what most escort fighters could survive if they pressed in straight in. To a Zero pilot accustomed to dueling fragile bombers with a few rifle-caliber weapons, the discovery was terrifying. Instead of stalking prey, they found themselves diving into a furnace of lead. One pilot's diary, later captured at Rabaul, recorded the moment bluntly. "They fire in every direction. Approach is death. One must choose carefully or never come home." Imperial Navy Pilot Diary, July 1942, NIDS Archive. And yet, behind the technical awe, the strategic reason remained brutally simple. America's bombers had not come merely to contest the skies. They had come to dismantle the machinery of Japan's war economy with arithmetic precision. Every bomb carried was a subtraction from Japan's shrinking resource pool. Every mission completed was another crack in the steel frame of the empire. By the time the Japanese pilots recognized this, the realization struck with the weight of an iron piston slamming down in rhythm, relentless, mechanical, and impossible to ignore. Back in Washington, thousands of miles away, the planning rooms vibrated with a different kind of noise. Not engines this time, but the scratch of pencils across maps, the click of typewriters, and the hum of calculating machines tallying fuel, bomb weights, and flight times. At the Army Air Force's headquarters, General Henry Hap Arnold pressed his staff relentlessly. He knew the Pacific could swallow men and machines whole, but without long-range bombers hammering the Japanese supply lines, the Navy would bleed ships just to hold the line. "Every airplane we push out there," Arnold wrote in a memorandum dated April 1942, "is another nail in Tokyo's coffin. We will drive steel into the heart of their logistics." His words weren't poetry. They were blueprints. Code breakers in Melbourne and Pearl Harbor fed an intelligence that shaped these missions. Intercepts from Japanese naval communications, decrypted under the Ultra program, revealed convoy schedules, airfield construction, and fuel shipments. When one transmission noted that tankers would sail from Balikpapan on a fixed rotation every 10 days, planners overlaid that fact with bomber radius tables. A B-17 based in Darwin, with a range of roughly 2,000 miles when stripped down, could intercept those routes if supported by staging fields. Intelligence became math on chalkboards. Arcs of flight time, percentages of fuel burn, and ordnance loads sketched like geometry problems. War became a classroom, except the chalk was written in blood. Factories in Seattle and Wichita matched this tempo. Boeing's Plant 2 alone produced 300 B-17s in 1942, each rolled from the line with fuselage frames still smelling of oil and paint. Women riveters hammered aluminum plates into place, sparks flying like welding torches inside a cavern. For every bomber dispatched to the Pacific, 10,000 hands had touched its skin, turned its bolts, or loaded its instruments. Each machine was a miniature city in steel, a deliberate answer to Japanese expansion. By the time the aircraft were ferried across the Pacific in island-hopping relays, they were not simply bombers. They were floating fortresses, born from industry, carried by logistics, sharpened by intelligence. When crews walked toward them on the tarmac, the scale became overwhelming. The B-17E stretched 74 feet from nose to tail, wings spanning 103 feet tip to tip. Empty, the bomber weighed nearly 36,000 pounds, fully loaded, over 54,000. 10 men climbed aboard, each assigned to a station like gears in the moving mechanism. Pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, radio operator, engineer, 2 waist gunners, tail gunner, ball turret gunner. The ball turret alone was a mechanical nightmare, an armored sphere rotating freely beneath the fuselage. A man crammed inside with twin 50-caliber Brownings, aiming by sight through a glass plate. When engines coughed to life, the entire structure shuddered as if the ground itself rejected the weight. Fuel tanks carried over 1,700 gallons of aviation gasoline, giving endurance for long hauls deep into Japanese territory. Bomb bays could carry 4,000 to 6,000 pounds of explosives, depending on range. To Japanese intelligence officers, those numbers were staggering. A squadron of 12 fortresses equaled nearly 72,000 pounds of bombs dropped in one run, roughly the weight of 2 fully loaded destroyers' main gun salvos combined. Each defensive station was positioned to cover blind spots, meaning that unlike earlier bombers, the B-17 was a fortress, not only in name, but in design. It was a flying machine gun nest. Japanese planners warned their fighter squadrons to expect resistance, but few believed that bombers could stand toe-to-toe with interceptors. That belief evaporated the moment contact came. The first serious clash unfolded near Rabaul in the summer of 1942. Radar picked up inbound contacts, and Zero fighters were vectored to intercept. As the formation of B-17s approached, the Japanese pilots accelerated into attack runs, confident they would carve through the heavy bombers as they had done with British Blenheims and Dutch Martin 139s months earlier. The air was thick with the smell of engine exhaust and cordite as they closed in. But as the Zeros dove head-on, streams of .50 caliber fire erupted from the bombers' noses. Tracers lanced through the sky, red lines cutting across the blue like heated wires. Pilots who pressed too close saw their wings shredded, fuel tanks punctured, engines flaming out. The shock was immediate. 1-0 disintegrated in mid-air under the combined fire of 3 fortresses. Its fragments spiraled downward in a fireball, striking the sea below. Another pilot swerved at the last instant, pulling back with holes stitched across his fuselage. For every bomber struck by cannon fire, another spat back torrents of bullets. Crews worked like cogs in a machine, waist gunners firing from side windows, tail gunners calling out ranges, radio operators passing bearings. In the chaos, one bomber trailed smoke, its number 2 engine dead, but it remained in formation, the interlocking fields of fire still unbroken. The Japanese realized in that instant that the B-17 was not a helpless giant. It was a fortress that punished attackers. Where 1-0 might bring down a British bomber in seconds, here a dozen Zeros could lose half their number just trying to pierce the defenses. A Japanese after-action report filed at Rabaul captured the unease. It is like facing ships of war in the air. Even when struck, they continue. Their teeth are many, and they bite in all directions. The Japanese did not retreat quietly. Within weeks of the first clashes, Fighter Command at Rabaul and Truk began reshaping their doctrine. If single attacks bled too heavily against the B-17s, then the answer would be mass. Flights of Zeros and Oscars were ordered to concentrate, striking in waves of 15 or 20, diving together from multiple angles. Commanders urged head-on assaults, the one approach thought to reduce exposure to crossfire. They instructed pilots to come straight down the bomber's throat, firing 20mm cannons in short bursts, then break away before the defensive guns could track them. To counter the fortress, Japan sought to turn the sky into a storm of converging steel. America adapted just as quickly. The bomber formations were already designed for mutual protection, but after those early bloody contacts, crews trained to fly even tighter. 12 ships forming a combat box, their arcs of fire overlapping so completely that each approach meant crossing at least 2 gun sites. Radar stations on the Australian coast began tracking outbound and inbound raids, giving Japanese interceptors less chance of surprise. By late 1942, the long reach of the P-38 Lightning appeared as well, its twin engines carrying escort pilots farther than the Japanese had expected. The air war hardened into a duel of move and countermove, each side engineering new solutions as though adjusting cogs inside a machine that never stopped turning. Inside the bombers, the fight tested men as much as metal. Missions stretched over 10 hours. The temperature at 25,000 feet plunged to 40 degrees below zero. Oxygen masks iced over, guns froze in their mounts, and frostbite gnawed through gloves. Crews endured vibration that rattled teeth and bones until their muscles felt wired into the airframe itself. Engines overheated, oil pressure spiked, and mechanical failures stacked up as the hours dragged on. Each fortress consumed 200 gallons of fuel per hour. If weather forced a detour or an engine dropped out, the margin for return collapsed quickly. The human toll showed in numbers as well as faces. In the first year of Pacific operations, bomber groups often lost 1 in 5 aircraft on a mission. A crewman's odds of surviving a full tour were slimmer than a coin toss. Diaries captured the strain. Sergeant William Hanlon, a waist gunner with the 19th Bomb Group, wrote in October 1942, "The cold and the noise are a second enemy. You lose feeling in your hands but must reload belts anyway. You think of nothing but the next second, the next burst, the next tracer line." His words reveal not heroics, but endurance, mechanical and unglamorous, like pistons hammering until they broke. And they did break. The fortress was strong, but not invincible. On October 16, 1942, the Japanese struck a decisive blow against a B-17 raid over New Guinea. 21 fortresses launched from Port Moresby, tasked with hitting Japanese shipping near Guna. Interceptors were waiting, Zeros from Lae Airfield, more than 40 in number. They attacked in coordinated waves, hammering the formation relentlessly. Defensive fire took its toll, but the weight of numbers pressed through. By the end of the engagement, 7 B-17s were downed in flames or forced to ditch. More than 70 American airmen were killed or captured. The impact of that day reverberated through command channels. Reports noted the shattered morale among surviving crews. Mechanics cataloged damage that stretched from shredded wings to engines torn free of mounts. Japanese observers celebrated, their communiques claiming that the fortress had been tamed at last. For the first time, it seemed the myth of invulnerability could be punctured. Numbers underscored the pain. 1/3 of the mission's strength erased in a single encounter, the equivalent of 2 whole squadrons gutted in an hour. The Americans refused to accept that October disaster as the final word. Within weeks, field modifications appeared on the tarmacs of New Guinea and northern Australia. Ground crews welded extra armor plates near the cockpit, jerry-rigged heavier ammunition belts into waist guns, and replaced worn barrels with locally machined substitutes. Commanders demanded tighter discipline in formation flying, insisting that bombers overlap fields of fire like interlocked gears. At the same time, engineers in the States were already sending out improved versions, the B-17F with stronger defensive arcs, and the long-range P-38 escorts arriving in greater numbers. Every setback triggered a design response, as though the entire industrial machine of America had shifted a cog to tighten the system. Innovation went beyond hardware. Tactics evolved with brutal speed. Bombers began flying at altitudes above 25,000 feet, where thin air robbed Japanese engines of power. Formation leaders drilled their men to concentrate fire, not spray wildly, so that attacking Zeros could be shredded in seconds when caught in converging arcs. Radar-directed fighter control tightened escort coordination. Even weather became a weapon. Missions timed to climb above cloud layers left Japanese fighters clawing blindly upward into gunfire. The fortress was not only an aircraft, it was a moving laboratory, its crews constantly rewriting the rules in blood and sweat. By 1943, the adaptations began to show their edge. The Japanese still threw squadrons at incoming raids, but their losses mounted unsustainably. Ammunition stockpiles dwindled, Fuel for training flights ran short, and the quality of new pilots dropped as the war dragged on. In contrast, American factories poured out replacements at a scale no empire could match. The math was merciless. Boeing produced over 4,000 B-17s in 1943 alone. Japan, by comparison, managed only a few hundred frontline fighters in the same year, and most lacked armor or heavy guns. The industrial balance tilted, and the sky reflected it. The climax came in raids against Rabaul in November 1943. Hundreds of American bombers, B-17s, and the newer B-24 Liberators streamed toward the massive Japanese base, escorted by long-range P-38s and carrier-based fighters. The morning air boiled with the sound of engines, a mechanical roar that drowned even the surf. Japanese radar lit up, fighters scrambled, but the sheer mass of metal in the sky overwhelmed coordination. Fortress crews locked into their combat boxes, gunners ready, oxygen masks frosting over as they climbed. The battle that followed was a furnace. Zeros dove in swarms, tracers lacing through the blue. But this time the escorts were there, lightning squadrons slicing into attackers, heavy caliber fire ripping apart formations before they even reached the bombers. For those fighters that pressed through, the reception was catastrophic. Waist gunners poured out streams of 50 caliber fire. Tail gunners stitched lines across incoming wings. Pilots described the sky as a cage of bullets. One Japanese ace, Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, later admitted, "The Flying Fortress was the toughest opponent. No matter how we attacked, its fire came at us like steel rain." Bombs fell with terrible accuracy. Docks, hangars, and supply dumps at Rabaul erupted into flame. Black columns rose as fuel storage tanks detonated, sending fireballs hundreds of feet into the air. Japanese gunners on the ground poured flak upward, but the formations pressed through, mechanical discipline holding them steady even as holes tore through wings and engines caught fire. One fortress staggered out of formation, its wing aflame, but another slid into its place instantly, the box unbroken. That precision was the fortress's true weapon, an iron rhythm that could not be disrupted by fear or chaos. By the time the raid ended, the Japanese base was crippled. More than 50 aircraft destroyed on the ground, vital fuel stores gone, repair facilities gutted. Losses on the American side were real. Several bombers did not return, but the weight of destruction was undeniable. Rabaul, once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific, was now a fortress under siege, unable to protect its supply lines. The aftermath proved the thesis that Japanese pilots had already suspected since 1942. America's flying fortresses were not easy prey. They were predators in their own right, machines that carried both hammer and shield into the sky. Statistics hammered the point home. Between 1942 and 1944, the USAAF flew over 30,000 heavy bomber sorties in the Pacific, delivering more than 65,000 tons of ordnance. Japan's fighter losses grew unsustainable, while oil imports collapsed to less than a third of pre-war levels. In the end, the Flying Fortress did what its name promised. It stood its ground in the air, forced the enemy to pay in blood for every interception, and dismantled the empire's war economy one bomb load at a time. The Japanese pilots who once believed they could slash through American formations learned the brutal truth: the bomber they thought was a target was in fact a fortress with teeth of steel.